In this explainer, we're tackling a really tough question, religious violence. But we're not just going to scratch the surface. We're going to dig deep into a structural argument for where it comes from, looking at the hidden architecture that can push a community, any community, toward conflict. So where does this kind of violence really come from? I mean, we all hear the simple answers, right? But what if those common explanations don't actually tell the whole story? What if they're not even close? The first place people usually point is a holy book. They'll find a verse here or there that seems to command violence, but honestly, that's just too easy. It completely ignores the fact that no text reads itself. It's always interpreted by a community of actual people. So what if the real answer isn't in the text at all? What if it's in a community that is fracturing from the inside out? And that's the core idea we're going to unpack today, that violence aimed outward is almost always a symptom of a deep conflict that actually started at home. So let's really get into this theory of fracture. We're going to break down the pattern, this architecture, of how a community's internal fights get twisted and redirected into aggression against an external enemy. And it turns out this process seems to follow a pretty predictable three-step sequence. First, you get an internal fracture. This is some kind of major dispute over who's in charge or what it means to be a true believer. This then leads to an authority crisis, where the usual leaders, the ones who could normally fix the problem, suddenly lose all their credibility. And then finally, all that built-up unresolved pressure has to go somewhere, so it gets discharged through outward projection, turning all that anger against a newly defined outside enemy. And this is absolutely crucial. This isn't a theory about just one specific religion. No way. This three-step sequence is a structural pattern that we can see playing out all through history in a whole bunch of different traditions. Just look at these examples, it's pretty wild. In Second Temple Judaism, you had intense, violent infighting between different sects before the big conflicts over political rule. In medieval Christianity, you had Europe's knights constantly at war with each other, which then got channeled outward into the Crusades. And look at something more recent, in Myanmar. A collapse of traditional religious authority came right before a wave of ethnic violence, all framed as defending the faith. You see the pattern? The internal crisis always comes first. Okay, so now that we've got this framework, we can use it to really understand the specific trajectory of militancy within Islam. We can trace a line all the way from its earliest internal conflicts to the modern idea of a global jihad. So this whole thing didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was built over centuries. It all begins with the fitnas. These were the first civil wars. Then, way later, huge external shocks like the Crusades and the Mongol invasions just shattered the existing social order, creating a massive crisis. This chaos is what led the scholar Ibn Taymiyyah to create a new legal architecture. And his ideas were eventually put into practice by Wahhabism, which ultimately gave modern jihadism the tools it needed. Everything starts with this one critical term, fitna. It means civil strife or sedition, and here's the key takeaway. The earliest, most foundational violence in Islam wasn't about fighting outsiders. It was a conflict among Muslims over who should be in charge. And right out of that internal conflict came this incredibly powerful and dangerous tool, takfir. This is the act of declaring another Muslim to be an unbeliever. Think about that. It wasn't developed to deal with people of other faiths. It was designed to police other Muslims who weren't seen as correct enough. The weapons of religious violence were forged for internal use first. But, and this is a really big but, it's so important to understand this wasn't the only thing going on. For centuries, the classical Islamic tradition actually built very stable, durable legal systems for coexistence, like the dhimma system that protected Jews and Christians. So what this means is that later militancy wasn't some kind of natural evolution. It had to actively work to tear down an established, long-standing tradition of pluralism. So a huge turning point came with this guy, Ibn Taymiyyah. He was writing during the absolute chaos of the Mongol invasions. And in response to that crisis, he issued a totally radical ruling. He said that Muslim rulers who failed to govern by Islamic law were now legitimate targets of jihad. This was a game changer. It radically expanded the definition of who the enemy could be, creating what you could call a usable precedent that militant movements would grab onto centuries later. Fast forward a few hundred years, and this militant logic gets a state engine. The alliance between the preacher Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab and the House of Saud took these ideas and gave them an army. They used force to purify the Arabian Peninsula of what they saw as incorrect forms of Islam. And then, in the 20th century, Oil money came along and helped spread this much more intolerant version of the faith all across the globe. And if you need any more proof that this is really an internal story, just look at this number. Over 90% of the victims of modern jihadist violence have been other Muslims. What is so often framed as a clash of civilizations is, when you look at the facts on the ground, a brutal civil war within Islam. Okay, but this brings up a pretty obvious question, right? The Quran itself has a very strong principle of non-aggression. I mean, think of the famous verse, "There is no compulsion in religion." So how on earth was that core principle bypassed to justify so much violence? Well, a militant reading doesn't just happen. It has to be actively constructed. And this was done using a few key interpretive tools. First, by elevating certain traditions about the Prophet, the Hadith, to expand what jihad could mean. Second, through this really controversial legal idea called abrogation, where it's argued that a single so-called verse of the sword basically cancels out hundreds of earlier peaceful verses. And finally, by just ripping verses out of their context, taking a line about one specific historical battle and claiming it's a timeless universal command to fight. All right, so all of this brings us to one final, really crucial reframing of this whole issue. If the answer isn't simply in the text, then, well, it means we've probably been asking the wrong question this whole time. So instead, the real question we should be asking is this: what internal crisis was so bad that it made a violent reading of the text seem necessary for survival? Who actually benefited from adopting that reading? And what deep internal fracture is being projected onto this so-called external enemy? To really get at the root of religious violence, we have to look past the scripture and into the historical crises that make a community feel that a violent interpretation isn't just an option, but the only option. The pattern isn't just about theology. It's deeply and often tragically human.